This is John Curatola from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Earlier this month, I delivered the following presentation about my new book, Armies Afloat: How the Development of Amphibious Operations in Europe Helped Win World War II. This broadcast was recorded in front of a live audience as part of the museum's Meet the Authors series. As a Marine officer who worked for the Army, who studies the Air Force, today I'm going to talk a lot about joint operations, because that's what this is all about, amphibious operations. And how does the U.S. military, not just the Army, but how does the U.S. military learn to do this? And the reason why I got interested in this topic is, as a Marine teaching at the Army Command General Staff College, I realized that, wait a minute, in the European theater, those are all soldiers that are going ashore, with Navy and Coast Guardsmen supporting them. And as I was doing my research, I found in the Second World War, the United States Marine Corps does basically 24 amphibious assaults in the Pacific. The United States Army in the Second World War does over 140 amphibious assaults in the Second World War. In the European theater alone, 10 division-size amphibious assaults. And I got to think, and this could have hurt my Marine Corps pride a little bit, that we suck all the air out of the room when it comes to amphibious assault. But how does the Army learn to do this? Because D-Day just doesn't happen. You have to learn how to do amphibious assault. And so that's really what I was looking at when I started this project a few years ago. Now, let's go back here and take a look at as late as 1942, the U.S. Army ain't interested in doing this mission at all. Some quotes from some of the commanders at this time regarding the amphibious exercises that the Army is conducting during this period. You can see here John P. Lucas, who's going to be in charge of the 6th Corps in the Mediterranean, says our training is unwieldy, ineffective, and dangerous. And a report goes up to the Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and he says, our training is operational, but at this time has been so deficient that real operations against a competent enemy would only end in disaster. Look at this, folks. This is 1942. This is right after America is already in the war. So it kind of tells you that the Army really has a lot to learn. And this idea of amphibious assault has largely been ignored, because in the First World War, you had this happen at Gallipoli. This is one of Churchill's brainchilds to go ahead and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and do an amphibious assault in the Dardanelles. And this thing turns out to be a 6-month fiasco. They don't have good ship-to-shore movement capabilities. They don't have very good beach selection because they don't have the intelligence for it. They don't have very good naval surface fire support, and they don't have really the joint ideas between the ground component and the naval component. And so by December of that year, they pull away, and guess what? Nobody else wants to do this stuff because it's too damn hard, especially in the face of machine guns and long-range artillery and barbed wire and armor and all those things that make modern warfare what it is. Now, after the war, and everybody's avoiding these ideas of amphibious assault, the Marine Corps is looking for a job. It's kind of in our DNA. We're always afraid of being legislated out of existence. You need an Army, you need a Navy, you need an Air Force now, but you only want a Marine Corps. And so the Marine Corps has to prove its worth. So in the interwar years, what the Marine Corps will do is start looking at this hard problem of amphibious assault. And they're going to develop doctrine to underpin this. And so what's going to happen is in the 1920s, we're going to send people out to the Palau Islands and start looking at, if we got into a war with the Japanese and we needed forward staging bases for our Navy and for our Army, what would that require to seize these small islands? And they send a gentleman out there named Pete Ellis to go take a look at this stuff. And he comes up with advanced base operations in Micronesia in 1921, folks, 1921, and it basically frames the problem. What would you need if you were going to land on a hostile beach? And from that seminal document, the Marine Corps turns its full focus on developing doctrine for amphibious assault. And in 1934, they're going to adopt what's called the Tentative Landing Manual. that's going to eventually become Navy doctrine. It will become the Fleet Training Manual 167 in 1938, and then the U.S. Army will adopt it, called FM 31 TAC 5, Landing Operations on Hostile Shores, in 1941. Why do I tell you this? Because doctrine matters. How do you function? How do you operate? How do you have the same sheet of music so everybody's working together? If you don't believe that, believe this guy. Alexander Vandegrift is the CG of the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal, and he earns a Medal of Honor for his leadership on that godforsaken island. But this is what he says about the Marine Corps in the Second World War. Despite its outstanding record as a combat force in the past war, the Marine Corps' far greater contribution to victory was doctrinal. That is, the fact that the basic amphibious doctrines which carried Allied troops over every beachhead of World War II had been largely shaped, often in the face of uninterested or doubting military orthodoxy. This guy is a combat vet. He's seen the elephant, and he says this about the Marine Corps' contribution. That speaks volumes, because everybody is using allies. Everybody is using what the Marine Corps frames on this. It's important. So let's talk just for a second before we go into the actual operations about an amphibious assault. And there's basically 6 functions of an amphibious assault. There's command relationships, naval gunfire support, aerial support, ship-to-shore movement, securing a beachhead, and logistics. This is worthy of a detour to kind of talk about these things for those of you who aren't U.S. Marines. I'll put that out there, okay? First of all, command relationships. Who's in charge of this thing? You have a naval component and you have a ground component. The commander of the amphibious task force is the Navy guy, and the commander of the landing force is the soldier or the Marine. Who's running this show? Who's in charge of this thing? This requires understanding between both components. All amphibious assaults are joint operations, meaning it requires multiple services working together and understanding their mission sets. So what you have here is a relationship between the ground component and his naval component. And what happens is when the Marines are on that Navy vessel, or our soldiers are on that Navy vessel, the Navy component is in charge. They are co-equals for planning. Once the landing force gets on those landing craft and go ashore, that relationship changes. Whereas the Navy is the supporting command, and the soldiers going offshore are the supported command. There's a nuance here. What that requires is both commanders to understand the larger mission and what those requirements are. This is something that's very, very important. The next thing is, as a U.S. Marine, when I put my foot on dry land, I have 0 combat power outside of the rifle or the pistol that I carry. But you know what I do have offshore is naval fires. The Navy, with its 16-inch guns or 5-inch guns on its destroyers, those can provide me a lot of firepower and prep the beach before I land. But there's a problem with naval fires, is they shoot relatively flat trajectories. Unlike howitzers or artillery that shoots arcs, this stuff shoots flat because it's designed to shoot other boats. So what you have to do is have those guys coordinate with the ground force so you don't shoot your own guys, okay? And you're going to have to be able to communicate with them as they're providing that kind of support. And so this requires deep coordination. Now, wait a minute here. You've all been to the beach, and you all know that after you get about 100 meters into the beach, there's usually a berm. And then behind that berm, there's another hill. Well, these flat trajectories can't get behind that berm, which is where the enemy might want to have defensive positions and supplies. How do I get beyond that because I have this flat trajectory? These funny things called airplanes. that can fly around. They can get behind that berm. Also, they can be dynamically tasked because a boat moves at X amount, my Navy brethren there. The ship moves at X amount of knots and he's constantly moving. That means your gun target line is moving, but the airplane can be dynamically tasked. That can call him over a radio and say, get over here. And he can get behind those defilade areas that the naval guns can't get to. This also requires coordination between the landing force and the guys in the air. Next, ship-to-shore movement. As we all know, with our landing craft that are made here in New Orleans, I have to get from my big boat, ship, I'm sorry again, sir, I see you looking at me, give me a dirty look. I have to get off the big transport, get on the smaller transport in the shallow water areas, and get from ship to shore. And in the Second World War, of course, we'll get the Higgins boats, and the Marine Corps will develop the amphibious tractor or the Amtrak, which will also be used in the European theater. But ship-to-shore movement is more than just guys, okay? You also have to determine who's in what boat. These are boats because they're smaller, sir, so don't look at me that way. And in what wave, and what are they carrying? This requires detailed planning for every lift in every wave. This is detailed centric work. And you have to put all of this together because you want to build combat power as fast as you possibly can on that shoreline. And in addition to getting guys ashore, I need logistics. Fuel, water, ammo, as referred to, beans, bullets, and Band-Aids ashore, because that's going to help you take the fight into the enemy. And so I need bulk fuel and bulk water and ammunition. That means not just guys, but stuff. So as the Marine Corps really starts out with the stuff, we still have horses and those kinds of things. So we experimented with this, but it really didn't work out real well. So we moved on from that. Another thing you have to do is after you get that stuff ashore, think about this. I unloaded off of my Higgins boat, and now I have all this stuff on the shore. Who's going to organize that? Because if you just throw it off of the vessel, you're going to have stuff all over the place. It has to be organized. So put all the ammo over here. Put all the food over here. Put all the personal demand items over here. Also, where are my evacuation points for my wounded? Somebody has to manage this mess. And this is all happening in combat. So this is a very difficult maneuver to do while you're in combat, to organize this stuff. Okay. And the last thing, communication and logistics. Remember I talked about the naval surface fire support and the air support working together? Well, somebody's got to establish communication nets. And these are the days we have crystal radios. This isn't, modern communications. And establishing this communication nets between the landing force, the naval force, and guess what? Those funny guys ahead of us, airplanes. Who establishes these communication networks? This is hard stuff. And the last thing, of course, is logistics, because I'm going to establish a lodgment ashore for what reasons? To push inland. Think about Normandy. We're going to land in Normandy beachhead, and then we're going to push in to St. Lo. We want to get to Paris. We want to get into France proper. That means I have to bring more and more stuff and people and men ashore. Now, having said all that, not you're all experts in amphibious assault. The problem with the United States Navy, sir, all respect, is that when it comes to the amphibious fleet, well, they're not held in great esteem by our Navy brethren. And I'll give you this quote right here. So a scufflaw sailor was telling another shipmate of his long list of various infractions of Navy discipline. When his shipmate asked the scofflaw was getting a bad conduct discharge, the scufflaw replied, "Hell no, I got 15 days in the brig and ordered to amphibs." The shipmate replied, "Gee," it was even more telling, "Gee, that's a lousy break." So being sent to amphibs is worse than getting a bad conduct discharge. Okay. But one of the gentlemen who really understands the joint nature of these amphibious assaults early on is this gentleman. His name is Kent Hewitt. Kent Hewitt is not your stereotypical good-looking, strack military officer. He looks like a bag of donuts. I think he's one of the unsung heroes of the Second World War. Why? Because he recognizes the Army and the Navy better get together pretty darn quick, because guess what? To get a toehold in North Africa and in Europe is going to require forcible entry, and it requires both services working together. And in Little Creek, Virginia, he's going to establish a shore party school. Those are the guys who are going to get those supplies off of those Navy vessels and push them inland for the Army to use. He's going to establish a quartermaster course to teach Army guys how to load boats, ships. Sorry, sir, I keep slipping tongue. Okay. Also, he's going to establish amphibious staff schools to learn about this doctrine that the Marine Corps put together so it can be on the same sheet of music. Not to mention, we're going to build a school for coxswains. Coxswains are the guys that drive these vessels from ship to shore. He's also going to establish a couple of training bases, one in Solomon's Island, Maryland, which would be a practice place for amphibious assault, and Bloodworth Island in the Chesapeake for naval surface fire support. We will also have a number of places at Camp Edwards, Massachusetts, and in Camp Caribou, Florida, to practice amphibious assault. The Camp Caribou place is so bad that when Omar Bradley visits it, he says, "This is the worst duty station outside of Yuma. The guy who put a base here should be court-martialed for stupidity." So let's talk about our first amphibious assault here in North Africa. Okay, we're going to do 9 separate landings at 3 different beaches here. Now, keep in mind, we are landing against Vichy forces, not Nazis. Okay, this is the Vichy French, and we don't know, are they going to fire on us? Are they not going to fire on us? It's kind of a mixed bag here in North Africa. And while we are successful, while the soldiers, along with our British counterparts, get ashore, there is a number of significant problems with this landing. First of all, the Army soldiers are slow in getting off of their big transport onto their amphibious vessel. Why? Because they're each carrying about 100 pounds of stuff. And they have to climb over the railing, and this is all in the dark, go down a cargo net while the ship is moving, while the landing craft is moving, hoping to God you don't fall off and go into the drink because you're not coming back up. So they're late by hours for many of these landing sites. The second thing, many of the coxswains who are driving these landing craft from ship to shore haven't seen an ocean since they left the farm in Iowa. And many of them are very poorly trained, and many of them land miles from where they're supposed to go. So if you're the Army soldier on that beach, I'm supposed to be here at Red Beach. Oh, that's 3 miles that way, I think, Skipper. We think, because I'm not really quite sure where I'm at. So the coxswains aren't that well trained. Also, when these landing craft show up with supplies, instead of doing the orderly beach supply, they're chucking stuff into the boat. That goes to shore. Then they're chucking it out of the boat onto the shore. And so after the first few waves at one of the landing beaches, they said it looked like a dump because there was stuff all over the beaches. It wasn't organized. So if you're looking for ammunition, I have to look at every one of these boxes to find my ammunition. It was poorly planned and poorly executed. Also, talked about communications. You think you might want radios that are waterproof? Yeah, that's kind of a problem too. And when they do take some rounds from the Vichy French, a number of the amphibious transport ships will move miles offshore, and my radios only have so much distance, and they start losing communication with the amphibious ships that are out there. So there are lots of problems, even though they're successful. And Lucian Truscott, who is one of the most effective commanders in the Second World War, will say this about Torch: the combination of inexperienced landing craft crews, poor navigation, and the desperate hurry resulting from the lateness of the hour finally turned debarkation into a hit-or-miss affair that would have spelled disaster against a well-armed enemy upon resistance. And another soldier says, "We received no opposition whatsoever from the beach. If we had in that condition of landing, it would have been a complete failure, in my opinion." Now, keep in mind, folks, there were those who were calling for the Normandy invasion as early as 1942 or 1943. I make the argument, not only do we not have the kit, we don't have the know-how to do those large-scale operations quite yet. The Mediterranean is the classroom by which the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force will learn to work together. Here's another stat for you. This is the actual part of the after-action report from the North Africa campaign. And if you look on the very top, that's the Western Task Force. That's Patton's 3 landings that come in. And if you look on there where I have circled, they used 629 landing craft, of which 216 were destroyed, basically 34%. The lower one, as the Eastern Task Force, had 104 landing boats, and they wrecked 98 of them for an overall loss rate of about 94%. Part of this is the coxswains not being well trained, not understanding how to operate the craft in the surfs of northern Africa. Also, this house has to do with some of the landing craft they're using at this time are not capable to handle that kind of surf. So there's an equipment problem and there's a training problem. But as you saw in those quotes, fortunately, nobody was really resisting. Yeah, there's some French units that resist, but fortunately, we're able to overcome that. But think about the learning value of that exercise. And what the Americans will do is they're going to establish what's called the 5th Army Invasion Training Center. And they're going to establish a whole host of schools after the landings. They're going to establish a battle training center for small unit leaders, an aerial observation school, an air assault school, a tank destroyer school, an engineering school, and yes, an amphibious assault training center. And they're going to establish this assault training center at a place called Arzu in Algeria. And the great part about it is that's where the 1st Division came ashore in the original assault for Torch. Well, to refresh the 1st Infantry Division in preparation for its assault on Husky, they make them assault the same beach. 1st Infantry Division wasn't very happy, especially since many of the instructors were new commissioned officers who had not experienced amphibious assault. Can you imagine? Terry de la Mesa Allen was not happy with that. But the idea here is we are establishing schoolhouses, and we are establishing doctrine centers, and we establish these in coordination with our Navy brethren. These become joint commands with Army and Navy talking together, working these issues together as a joint force. That's what's important about this. And they're doing this, folks, in theater. This is not happening back in D.C. or in the United States. This is happening in forward areas that we're doing this stuff. Okay? Something happens during this time, too, is we're going to be introducing new amphibious vessels that come in. The LST, the landing ship tank, the LCT, the landing craft tank, and the LCI, the landing craft infantry. These are 3 of a host of amphibious platforms that the Americans will develop. This allows you to go from ship to shore and to move bulk logistics. The LST that I have up in the very top is so important. Of the 1,200 LSTs that they make in the Second World War, the availability of that platform actually drives Allied strategy. How many do I have? Why? Because it's a lift problem. How do we get guys from point A to point B? Matter of fact, the LSTs are so important, and I'll give you a quote, that after or before the Anzio operation, this is a problem because we have to get ready for Normandy. Well, Winston Churchill is upset because he's not getting all the amphibious assaults lift that he wants. And he says, and I quote, "The fate of 2 great empires rests with some goddamn thing called LSTs." That's how important these things are. And one thing you can do with these LSTs that is uniquely American, I can take this vessel. It can carry about 1,900 tons. It can carry about 100 troops. It can go about 9,000 miles. It's a seagoing vessel. I wouldn't encourage you to do that because it's a flat bottom, okay? But what it can do is move bulk ashore. I don't need a port anymore. I can land stuff on an unprepared beach, open up the clamshell doors, lower my landing ramp, and start moving trucks and tanks and troops right there on an unprepared beach. Yes, I like ports. I can move stuff faster, but what this does is it allows the American Army to move ashore without a fixed port. And think about the implication that's going to have for the Pacific as well. These things are very, very important because now I have portable armies. This is going to come true here in Sicily in July of 1943. What you're going to have is Patton and the 8th and the 7th Army are created at sea. They're our seaborne army. And they're going to land the 3rd Division at Licata, the 1st Infantry Division at Gela, and the 35th Division at a place called Scogliti. And what the Americans are supposed to do is protect the British left flank because the British are the main effort. They're supposed to land at Siracusa and the Canadians down at Pachino, and they're going to push up that east coast of Sicily and go right to cut the Germans off before they can escape. So the Americans have the B-roll here. But one of the things that the Americans don't have in their sector is a port. But you're going to land a whole army and other attachments across these 3 beaches without a fixed port. That is significant because when you went to North Africa, every one of those objectives were around a port for subsequent operations. And so here what you're seeing is the Army for the first time really exercising this ship-to-shore movement, not only in terms of men and material, but bulk logistics and movement ashore. Now, it goes well. Again, we meet our objectives. However, there's still some problems. Now, at this time, the United States Army Air Corps, which becomes the United States Army Air Forces, which becomes U.S. Air Force, has now been given equal footing with the ground and the naval component. Because of that, I'm an Air Force officer. I can do what I want. So while the Navy and the Army are planning for Sicily, the Air Force says, we got our own thing going on. We don't really need to talk to you. We're going to go deep. We're going to hit the enemy's supply lines. We're going to go hit their factories. We're going to hit their lines of communication. We really don't see the need to support troops in the field. That's not a good use of our assets. And as a matter of fact, it was only a few days before this operation occurs that the Air Force says, oh, by the way, here's our plan. Okay. So when the Army lands over the beaches of Gela and Scogliti and Licata, there are no Air Force attack aircraft over those beaches. The only attack aircraft there are Luftwaffe and Regina Aeronautica that are flying over those beaches unhindered. As a matter of fact, the Germans are going to fly up to 89 individual raids over that fleet. And so you don't have any air cover for those soldiers as they go ashore. Also, there's a problem with beach parties again, because what happened is they created some beach party units to kind of beef up this capability. Where did they get those soldiers from? Well, I'll tell you. Every unit had to give up a couple guys to build these units. And for those of you who served in the military, if you have to give up a guy for another unit, you didn't get the A team. But what you do see here is better ship-to-shore movement, better logistics over the shore, and excellent naval surface fire support. As a matter of fact, the 1st Infantry Division is able to hold the plain of Gela because the Navy comes in and plinks most of the Hermann Göring Division's armor as they're coming down the plain of Gela. It's a phenomenal story if you ever read it. One thing that the Navy does do and the Air Force does do is they're going to put a steel plate on top of some of these LSTs, and no kidding, they will fly Piper Cubs, I'm not making this stuff up, off of these LSTs, and they'll fly along the beach calling in naval fires in a cloth-covered airplane. And then when you run out of fuel, you just kind of land on the beach and hopefully you make it back to U.S. forces. But this is something that they do with these modified LSTs. But anyway, getting back to the air problem, George Patton, who's the CG of the 7th Army, is a little bit upset because the Navy doesn't have any air cover on top of it. All of the anti-aircraft gunners, both ashore and largely on the fleet, have now been conditioned that anything that flies over is an enemy aircraft. Okay? Well, on D+1, Patton wants to commit his airborne reserve to help shore up his lines there at the beach of Gela. And they take off at dusk and they fly at night over the naval flotilla. 144 aircraft took off that night, 23 were lost, 37 were badly damaged, with a 16% loss rate. The airborne regiment suffered 229 casualties, 81 dead, 132 wounded, and 16 missing. Because you didn't have that coordination between the air element and the surface element. And one of the pilots who was flying one of these C-47s over the fleet said, and I quote, "Evidently, the safest place for us tonight was over Sicily, would have been over enemy territory and not over our own fleet." So what you see here is a problem with regard to air and ground coordination here in Sicily. Okay. Now, our next major operation is we're going to go to the boot of Italy. The British are going to cross the Straits of Messina. They're going to push up the Toe. And what's going to happen is the 6th Corps under Major General Ernst Dali is going to go ahead and do an amphibious assault there at Salerno. Now, what's interesting about this is the night before they land, the Italians do what they do a lot. They surrender, okay? I'm Italian, I can say that, all right. And so the Americans really think that, oh, this is going to be a cakewalk. The problem is that night when they surrender, the Germans execute an operation called Axe, and what they do is they occupy all the former Italian locations. So this is going to be a fight, but the Americans just don't know that yet. Now, the Navy is trying to tell the Army, hey, you know what we can do? We can hit 275 targets, pre-sighted targets on that beach at Salerno to help you out. And at this time, the Navy or the Army is not interested because they think stealth is more important than prepping that battlefield. Also, the Germans have put a bunch of sea mines in front of this beach. So as the Americans start coming ashore that morning, they're running into these prepared German positions, and they're also running into sea mines. Many of the landing craft aren't making it ashore because they're hitting these mines, and they're being told to return back to their ships. A number of coxswains will violate orders and push through those minefields to get those soldiers and supplies ashore. The Americans have some significant problems when they land on these 4 beaches. The bottom 2 beaches, blue and yellow, are basically shut down. Beaches red and green, they have success and are able to get ashore. But again, they don't have very good coordination in terms of minesweeping, landing party function, and the embarkation from ship to shore is problematic. But here's something else that happens on the way to the forum, folks. Remember 2 months ago when I landed, the Air Force wasn't there? Guess who's there? The Air Force, in numbers. And what's important about this is in September. Husky started in July. So in the short span of 2 months, the Air Force is on board. And this is innovation, folks, that's happening bottom up, not top down. These are guys in theater figuring this stuff out. That's significant. And on top of that, what the Navy has done, they've actually trained A-36 pilots, which A-36 is like a P-51 before it became a P-51. They train them in naval surface fire spotting. They'll train them. And so Air Force guys will actually be calling in naval fires here at Salerno. And on top of that, you will see the first integration of air, infantry, and armor, and naval fires working in a concerted manner. Think about how intricate that is to clear that airspace, get the airplane out so I can get the naval fires in, get the infantry in so they don't get hit. That requires a lot of detailed coordination. And they're doing this here at Salerno. So there's a significant change in the fact that they are now learning how to work together in this operation. And one thing the Air Force will also develop is something called a Rover Joe. This is something they had tried in North Africa and they really adopt here. Well, they will put an aircraft over the landing beaches, and he's going to get a call from an individual battalion that's engaged in combat and say, I need some help. And that Rover Joe will contact aircraft that are flying around waiting on call to help deliver the pain to the Germans. So again, the Air Force now is playing in what we call the amphibious objective area, laterally and vertically. They're involved in this, and that's important. Also, the Germans counterattack in a gap between the British that land to the north and the Americans to the south, and they're going to land an airborne regiment in there. And you know what? It works, and nobody shoots at them. One, they avoid the fleet altogether. They fly parallel and they land in, but they get the word passed. Don't shoot at anything after 9 o'clock. And they do. And that parachute landing works very well, and it basically saves the day. So again, you're starting to see this idea that they're learning and they're working together. Now, the Americans and the Allies, we get stuck there in Italy at the winter line in the Apennine Mountains for lots of reasons, and I won't go into them for you. And so Churchill comes up with this idea, this big left hook, Operation Single at Anzio, and you've probably heard about that before. And the idea here is to push in, cut the German line of communication that is supporting their defensive positions in the south, and then what will happen is the Germans will run for Rome, and we can push up through the winter line. That's the plan. Was a little bit of a problem with that. See, this is going to happen in January of 44. And what's going to happen in June of 1944? You know where I'm going with this. I need men and material for the cross-channel invasion. So what happens is a lot of that lift, LSTs, get pulled out of the Mediterranean and up to the UK in preparation for the big cross-channel invasion. So why do the Americans and the Brits only land one division each with 2 Ranger battalions off to the side? You know the answer already. There's not enough lift. So they make the battalions, the landing force, fit the lift equation as opposed to what the requirement would be to conduct that operation. They successfully land. They find a bunch of drunk Germans there. The problem is the Germans were able to mobilize like 10 divisions in the short matter of a few weeks, and they were able to basically contain this operation. There's a whole story behind it. But as the Americans and the Brits try to maintain this beachhead, remember, there's a lack of lift. They have basically 6 LSTs and a bunch of other vessels. What the Army develops are called mobile loads. What is that? What they would do is, because you can drive in and drive off of these LSTs, what they would do is take an LST full of empty trucks, sail it down to Naples, which is a major port, load them up with gear and stuff, drive them back on the LST, float it back up to Anzio, drive them back off, unload all the gear, and then repeat the process. They're becoming more efficient with the lift assets they have. And this is called the Anzio Highway. This is what allows the 6th Corps to stay alive as they're facing all these German divisions there in Anzio. So again, you're seeing innovation. Also, the Army Air Force says, you know what we can do? We can build an airfield in here too, and they do. They build an airfield in the amphibious objective area, and they actually put a squadron of Spitfires in there. Problem is, the Germans can see it and can range it and blow them up, so they kind of stop that. But the idea here is that the Air Force is willing to do that now. And what the Air Force and the Army and the Navy are doing on a nightly basis, they're meeting to talk about targets for tomorrow, what perceived targets might be out there, or on-call targets. They're planning this stuff out every day, intense, working together to leverage every asset that they have. So again, you're seeing this growth coming from the bottom up, not from the top down. And you can see here this idea of ship-to-shore movement. We're going to take that port of Anzio, and we're going to allow it to have LSTs come in. And here you can see a Sherman tank coming off of that port. Another thing that we have at this operation, too, are these brand new radios called SCR 300s. And there is one up in our Arsenal of Democracy, if you want to see it. And it allows divisions and their battalions to talk about 3 miles away from each other with a reliable radio. So again, this communication piece gets to be integral to these successful operations. Now, as we all know, we're gearing up for this big cross-channel invasion, and that's going to take over most people's main effort. But what's happening here is as we're getting to Normandy, you're starting to get into the culmination of those lessons learned. And one of the things they're going to do is they're going to establish what's called the Q School, or the Quartermaster School, where they're going to bring Air Force, Navy, Army, and our British counterparts into the same room to talk the same language, to learn about each other's doctrine, staff planning, orders generation. They're going to do this stuff in February of 44. Then they're going to establish a whole host of amphibious training bases throughout the UK, with the most important one being at Woolacombe, which is near the Taw Estuary, and when it's slapped in Sands, where they will do live fire exercises. But in addition to that, they're going to establish amphibious training places at Roseneath, Falmouth, Cornwall, Dartmouth, Teagemouth, Salacombe-and-Diva, Millhaven, Pernouth, and South Wales. And that's just a few, folks. And as a matter of fact, the Brits have to help us maintain our landing craft. Here's an important statistic for those of you who are fleet managers. 99.6 of those amphibious craft sortie on D-Day. 99.6. That's huge. Also, they established new coxswain training, better ship-to-shore movement. And when you see the D-Day operation unfold, most of those units land pretty near they were supposed to land. I know Utah, they're 2,000 yards off. I got that. But the tide pushed them that way. But the Navy is going to establish schools for these guys, and they're going to give them maps and photographs. And they're going to take, the Air Force is going to fly at wavetop level, take pictures of that shoreline, and then give it to the coxswains so he can go, hey, yeah, that's where I'm supposed to land. He can actually look at a picture of where he's going to land. So they're sharing this navigation equipment. At the same time, the Navy is going to show up with a few battleships and do some pre-naval fires, because now the Army says, we've got enough kit. You can go ahead and blow those beaches up before we get there. Problem is, they miss most of the targets. And I'm not faulting him. It's just what happens. But one thing that does happen is those Navy destroyers show up, and they come within 1,000 yards of those beaches, and some of them take direct hits from the German fixed positions there to bring the fires on those German tactical locations. Also, the Army and the Navy will establish these shore fire control parties. They're going to have 44 of them, one per firing battalion, so they can coordinate their fires between each other. And on top of that, you're also going to have the Air Force get involved here. They're going to prep the battlefield, what will be called the transportation plan. They're going to drop all those infrastructure, all those networks that are sitting there in northern France and in Belgium proper, so the Germans can't move their troops around. They're prepping the battlefield for the Army as they go in. And they're going to do what's called battlefield air interdiction, where they're going to blow up those trains and those roads and those bridge structures. And they're going to establish an entire Air Force. The 9th Air Force is going to work in direct support of those Army forces on the ground. What we know today is close air support. The P-47 is the A-10 of its day. And so they're going to be deliberate in their execution of this. As a matter of fact, the Air Force is going to fly over 2,000 sorties of close air support that day alone. The Germans will say that it was effective because what would have normally taken them 12 hours to move their reserves took them 80 hours to move their reserves over time. At the same time, the Air Force is going to put what called air support parties out there. And these guys are calling in that tactical air to support the guys on the ground. So the Air Force puts these air support party teams with the infantry divisions to call in that air. At the same time, the Navy will put out what's called fire direction tenders that are looking for the Luftwaffe. If it shows up, only 3 planes show up. You don't know that at the time, but this idea of vectoring defensive fighters in this airspace. But what's amazing to me is the communication network. 90,000 transmitters. And as most of you know today, we talk about the electromagnetic spectrum. They only have so much bandwidth. How do you manage that? This requires very detailed planning between the Navy, the Air Force, and the ground component, and to establish these discrete call signs so you know who you're talking to. And there are literally annexes and annexes of nothing but call signs. Each individual battalion had a call sign. Each ship had a call sign. You had to kind of look at it to go, oh, that's the USS Neversail, or whoever it is. Logistics. As you can see here, we're going to preload a lot of this stuff, but look at these numbers. We're going to push 130 guys ashore on that one day, 17,000 vehicles. And the plan was to push 6,000, then 9,000, and then 12,000 tons ashore as we go forward. And I know these numbers don't mean anything to you. So let's take a look at this. Just take a little detour here. An infantry division has 14,000 guys in it, okay? And the number of vehicles is 2,230, okay? And the plan is, by D+30, to move 12 divisions ashore, and then 16, and then by D+90, 3 months later, 21 divisions, plus a bunch of other attachments. Think about how much stuff you're moving ashore. Hey, wait a minute, Doc. You talked about ports, and we like those things. And so what they decide to do is bring their own. And they bring what's called the mulberries. This is Mulberry A. It's an artificial harbor that we will build a few days after the landings. And they actually work pretty good. The offload rates are about 1,000 to 1,500 tons per day. I can offload an LST in a few hours. So they're really efficient. But here's the problem. A storm comes and it wrecks it. You can't use it. The American mulberry is completely wrecked between 19 and 21 June. So what are you left with if you're the U.S. Army? The methods you already produced. And what you will see happen is, with the methods that were developed in the Mediterranean theater, we're never going to meet what the actual requirement was, but we get about 80%. It's good enough. And this is coming over the beaches, folks. So again, I didn't need that port. I need a port. I like a port. I want Cherbourg. But until I get Cherbourg, which is already spiked, the Germans blew it up, everything for the Americans are coming across this shore in the methods that we talked about in the Mediterranean. No other nation can do that. And as far as the German response to what goes on, I think this is the most telling. Here's Gerd von Rundstedt, who's the OB West commander for Normandy. And he will say, 4 factors must be emphasized: complete mastery of the air, the landing troops, the artillery of strong English and Allied naval guns ranging from battleship to gunboat were important. The most precise knowledge of the coast, its obstacles, defense establishment, swift building of superiority of numbers and material at the beachhead in just a few days. So what's he talking about? Air support, naval surface fire support, ship-to-shore movement, logistics, and beachhead establishment. The things that we talked about 30 minutes ago. He says this in his report, even though he never read, U.S. military doctrine. We got one more operation, Operation Dragoon, which is supposed to be the anvil for Overlord. Ike wanted to have this thing happen at the same time as D-Day. But you know why he couldn't do it at the same time as D-Day? Yeah, not enough lift. That's right. So it goes August 15th. And what's interesting about this particular operation is Ike wants a second port because he needs throughput, and Cherbourg is slimed for a while. So I can use the port of Marseille, and I can push up through southern France, and it's 100 miles closer to Germany than what Normandy is. But what's interesting about this, the topography there in the Riviera is a little bit more difficult. You have to land 3 separate divisions in 3 different beaches. That required 3 different task forces. And you know what they do? They do it, operating independently of each other once they get ashore. And so the Navy is there providing the fire support. The Air Force is prepping that whole area. Oh, and by the way, the Air Force is flying out of Corsica to provide ground support. And the Navy has carriers out there. And it's all being coordinated by a shipboard control center controlling naval air and U.S. air at the same time. Think about how complex that is. And the official historian of the United States Navy will say this about the Dragoon or Anvil operation. If Teddy in the Pacific was the perfect amphibious assault on a small scale, Dragoon was nearly flawless on a large scale. So in closing here's the things I want to leave you with. That the U.S. and the Allies were learning organizations. They got punched in the face. They reassessed, they rewrote, and then they applied these lessons. Innovation and resources LSTs and airplanes and those radios far outstripped the German or the Axis ability to match that capability. Combined arms integration to a whole new level. We know the Germans developed the stuff in Blitzkrieg, but you know what that they're not doing in Blitzkrieg? They're not talking to the Germans. Tanks aren't talking to the German airplanes. The Americans are. They're coordinating at these tactical levels with radios, and they're figuring this stuff out. This idea of large-scale expeditionary logistics over the shore to build combat power occurs over time. And joint operations, breaking service parochialism. My Navy brethren, my Army brethren, my Army Air Corps brethren, working together. That's what's important about this operation, is that we learn, we develop, and we work so much faster than the Axis does. And so with that, I will open the floor for any questions you may have.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Mike Alexander has a question here.
It's all Mike.
Left, John.
Very good talk, John. As you know, my dad taught at Landing Forces Training Unit in Coronado.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a subject that's dear to my heart. In the Omaha Beachhead book that the Army put out in 45, 46, it shows the 116th Regimental Combat Team and their different lifts into the beach.
Mm-hmm.
They had LCTs with self-propelled 105s, and they also had rocket boats.
That's right.
Could you discuss how effective that fire was in keeping the heads down on the beach?
First of all, it's in the book, so you can read it for yourself. There's a paid political advertisement there. But yes, what they would do is they would take these LCTs and they would put literally 1,000 rockets in a salvo on these things. And that's the one picture you saw, and there were these rockets taking off. What they would do is they would saturate the beach with these things. And the beauty of that is it would make the Germans all hunker down. It gives you a couple of minutes before they pop their heads back up, and you can move ashore because they're all hunkering down as this enfilade of fire keeps coming in on these shores. Also, they'll modify some of the LCTs to put tanks and self-propelled artillery on them. Yeah, it's okay. But the problem is who's coordinating that fire? And that's one of the problems that they have, because if I have an infantry battalion ashore and I'm in that tank and that LCT going ashore, how do I know who's out there? So I don't have what we call a blue on blue operation. And so they have the capability to fire, especially in those initial waves where there aren't a lot of guys forward, and they do. And they'll actually put extra ammo on these LCTs because you don't want that tank to roll off of that boat, landing craft, without its full complement of rounds on it. So they actually will plant extra magazines on those LCTs so they can provide some of that support. But again, the problem is they have to be cleared for those fires. That is a requirement for those armor assets to shoot over the gunnels. And actually, they'll raise the platform the tank sits on so it can shoot over the gunnel and not shoot your front door, which you don't want to do that. So they do use those things as part of the suppression plan going ashore. Does that answer your question, Mike?
And if not, he can buy the book.
Yeah, buy the book.
Next question is going to be to your left.
I can tell you the page number. Never mind. Just kidding.
I'm going to buy the book, but did England or did any of the other allied countries build any of these landing craft?
Absolutely. The Brits build a whole fleet of them. Okay. As a matter of fact, the LST is actually a British innovation. They had, in South America, they had these oilers. You would use them to go pull oil out of these tanks and then offload them into discharge barge. And they're the ones who first come up with this idea of the LST. And they actually use it in the North African campaign in Torch. And the Navy is already like, these are great things. So they're already building them. The U.S. will build the bulk of them, but the Navy certainly builds a number of the same vessels themselves. So it's not just a U.S. only show, but we build the bulk of them.
And while I wait for more hands, I don't recall, LCAs. That's the
Landing
majority of
craft
the
assault,
Rangers.
that's the British version.
landing
That's
at.
right. And they're a little bit smaller. They're a little bit shallower in terms of the draft. But the problem is the water tends to kind of flood in on these things if you're in stormy weather, which you are, of course, on June 5th and June 6th.
Well, first of all, John, thank you very much for the presentation. I have actually one thing that intrigued me. I mean, you mentioned the fact that Omaha Beach, the destroyer went to 100 yards, right? I mean,
1,000 yards.
1,000, sorry, not 100 yards. 100 yards, no, will be too close. 1,000 yards, though, it's also very close. I mean,
Yes, it is.
because first of all, you can be shot by the German gun,
And they are.
and they are. And the second thing actually is that you actually risk hitting sandbanks, right? I mean, because the keel actually,
Yes.
So my question is, this is actually the initiative of the destroyers, right? Because they actually saw what was happening on Omaha. Of course, Omaha was very complicated.
Yeah.
So my question is, how much initiative you have to take as a commander, right? I mean, because of course you get all these this layout of orders, it's all very well, right? The doctrine too, but you also need to grab the initiative, right? I mean, it seems to me this is the big lesson from Omaha Beach.
Yeah. One of the things that happens is one of the naval commanders sees what's happening at Omaha Beach, and he will actually get on the radio and say, they're killing our boys, get in there. And it's an order to those Navy destroyers. However, I will tell you, those Navy destroyers are already moving. To your point, initiative on their own point. And the fact that, as you brought it out, many of those guys only have a few inches of water underneath their keels to support those troops ashore. So there's a lot of initiative. And I think this is an important thing about the American military, is that we push responsibility down, NCO, corporals, junior officers, to make those kinds of decisions. It's one of the things that makes our military great then and even now, to take that kind of initiative in the absence of orders. Because again, they're already moving when they're doing that stuff. And what's interesting is when these destroyers get in some of these areas, they don't have radio contact with those guys ashore. Well, how do you know you're not shooting your own guys? And one of the things they come up with is they'll see the Americans that are ashore and what they're shooting at, because they can see the puffs. And so, hey, they're shooting at that thing right there. Shoot there. So they'll use some of their own initiative, even though they don't have direct radio comms, to help those infantry guys take out that gun nest. And in some cases, the Army guys will get out lights, signal lights, and start doing Morse code. Hey, there's a guy right there. And so again, they're going to take a lot of this initiative at that subordinate level to provide that kind of direct support. And again, I think that is one of those hallmarks of the American military that makes a big difference.
We have a question in the back here, John. I think we're going to get one, maybe two more.
Yeah, so obviously you have a lot of educational processes going on, and you have technical innovations, you have, as you've talked about, the beach party, the disembarkation, and obviously there's also bodily movements, right? You have to learn how to disembark. And so looking at this, it's a totally different type of question, but looking at this image, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're learning how to disembark. Could you just talk a little bit about this image?
Yeah, this is actually at Camp Carabel, that place that in Florida that was the worst duty station in the Army. And basically, what they do in terms of D-Day at Woolacombe, what they'll do is they're going to have these practice fields where soldiers, all they do is practice disembarking, getting themselves into a defensive position to protect that amphibious assault, and then practice moving off the beachhead. One of the things that we didn't talk about here is each one of these landing craft is basically its own combined arms little unit, meaning there's an engineer guy with some satchel charges or maybe a flamethrower. There's a guy with a machine gun or a BAR. There's a guy with a rifle, and so these are small combined arms teams that are on these boats to build that combat power once they get ashore. And each of them has a specific role and a specific mission, and they will constantly train almost to the point of doing this in their sleep, because it has to be muscle memory. They have to instinctively know what they're doing. And if you read the opening story of my book is Dr. Howe. Hal Baumgartner, and he talks specifically about how they train and they train and they train. And they train not as a platoon, they train as a landing craft. Those are the guys he's eating dinner with. Those are the guys he's talking with because they all trust each other inherently in terms of what they can expect from each other. Now, unfortunately for Dr. Hal, most of his gentlemen are killed, but they are doing this with rote training to make sure they understand the requirements. You're welcome.
All right, last question, John.
So my question is, obviously you're an expert in this field with lots of experience, but I'm just interested in kind of a research question. If there was anything you discovered in the course of your work on this book that you weren't expecting or that surprised you?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing that really surprised me, I'll be honest with you, was the fact that the Air Force came around. And that's not a shot at the Air Force. Please don't. Look, I'm the proud son of an Air Force officer, a career officer, so please take that as a shot. But the Air Force really wanted to focus deep and focus long because strat bombing is where we're going to make our money and make our claim to fame. But the idea of them realizing we have a tactical responsibility there, and guys like General Elmwood Quesada is going to, hey, we need to support 3rd Army as they're pushing in, 9th Army as they're pushing on the northern shoulder. This realization from the Air Force, because the Air Force, again, in interwar years, strat bombing is where we're going to go. It's how we're going to win the war. And this realization that, yeah, you need tactical aircraft too. And the fact that they recognize that, even though they don't want to do it. As a matter of fact, for the planning for Normandy, that's a significant emotional event because the strategic bombers don't want to help shape France in preparation for D-Day. They want to go deep and they want to go long. And actually, Ike has to go up to Toohey Spots, who's in charge of strategic air forces, to go, you're going to do this. And it actually goes up to FDR, and Ike knows he's going to win this fight, and the Air Force goes, okay. But the idea that they shift off of what was they saw their bread and butter and understand there's a tactical requirement, I think is significant for the Air Force to shift doctrinally and in terms of assets and airmen and men. That's something that really kind of stood out. And how fast they do this in theater from the bottom up and not from the top down. So that was something that jumped out at me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. John Curatola.
It's pretty good.